I'm going to demonstrate how to rotary cut a 3-inch square like the ones shown here. If you're new to rotary cutting, you might want to visualize or draw your shape beforehand, because sometimes when you use these rulers it gets confusing where the lines are. Now 3 inches is pretty easy, but when you're cutting 3 1/4 or 3 1/8, it gets a little confusing sometimes. You also want to make sure that your fabric has been pressed ahead of time. If you don't press your fabric and there's wrinkles in it, often you won't get a straight cut. So make sure you've pressed that fabric. When cutting, you want to always cut away from your body and shut your blade after making the cut. Use as many of the lines on the mat and on the ruler as you can to help ensure accuracy. So let's put this aside, and first thing I'm going to do is take my fabric. Doesn't matter which side I cut on. I'm going to turn it over on this side because it's easier to see this selvage. The selvage is at the edge of the fabric. It's called the straight of grain, and this is called the cross grain. When you're cutting a square, you want to make sure that you have cut one side of the square on the straight of grain and the other side of the square on the cross grain. It makes it easier to sew when you're using the straight of grain or cross grain, as there's not very much give on that part of the fabric. So I'm going to take my rotary cutter, and I want to get rid of the bulk of this fabric. So I am going to line up this straight of grain on this line, and I'm going to put my rotary cutter over the top of this. And let's see, to make it a little bit easier, I am going to line up with this line and this line to ensure that I've got a pretty straight cut. So I'm going to hold the ruler with my hand, push down on that to keep it flat, and I'm opening my blade, starting a little in front of where my fabric is, and I'm cutting away from my body. I'm going to move my position, open up my blade, cut away from my body, shut my blade. And there's my first cut. I know that this is a straight, nice, even cut on both sides. I can see that these lines are perpendicular. And I'm just going to turn it around like this. And I'm going to use the lines on my mat to line that up. And I see if I'm going to cut a 3-inch square, I'm going to go 1, 2, 3. So I'm going to cut this off. I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, and I'm going to cut the top off. So I'm going to use this ruler, my rotary ruler. I'm going to line up, and remember I said to use as many lines as you can. So I like to look here, and I see that this line is lined up, this line is lined up, all these are lined up. My fabric is underneath this line, this fabric. It's underneath this line. Up. Actually, I'm going to move that just a little. I'm going to put pressure on this, open up my blade, start a little before the fabric, cut away, shut my blade, reposition. Going to open my blade, start a little in front of the ruler. My blade's going right up against that ruler, and then I shut the blade. And now I have a 3-inch square. If I want to double check that, I can come over here to where I drew that 3-inch square, or I can use my mat here to check that. And I see 1, 2, 3 by 1, 2, 3.